The Emerald Knight, Chapter 10. The sheds on the edge of the training ground were meant to be a punishment. They held no creature comforts, no beds or shelves or cabinets to be filled with trinkets from home, and no fireplace to keep away the chill in the night of the cold seasons, which was not so much an issue in the middle of summer. Clyn wished for any kind of cold. But the windows had been boarded up despite the heat, so Clyn sat in darkness, sweating through his underclothes, and estimated that the sun had risen an hour ago. He hadn't eaten his lunch because he was being pestered, he had skipped dinner because he was an idiot, and breakfast had been served at dawn while he sat alone in the dark. No, not alone. The night before, he had tried to do what had been asked of him. He had stripped to his underclothes and handed everything to the teacher. The punishment was supposed to be boredom. He couldn't have any hidden knickknacks or books, nothing to distract himself from what he was supposed to be doing, thinking about what he did wrong. He certainly wasn't supposed to have any weapons. When he tried to hand the sword over, the instructor had screamed. The second her hand touched it, she jerked back, and Clyn watched as the flesh melted from it. He joined her shrieks, which brought others. He heard her say, "Let him keep the goddamn thing," through clenched teeth as a healer led her away. So he had kept the goddamn thing. It sat in his scabbard by his side, not as it normally did on his back. He stared at it in the darkness, as it pulsated with a weak, green light. "Master." "Fuck off," he said out loud, folded his arms over his knees, and decided to stare at the door instead. "They're starving you. They intend to kill you." "I'm going without the things you only get if you're good," Clyn explained, not for the first time. "Because I messed up. This is on me." "They're going to kill you." Clyn laid his face onto his folded arms and closed his eyes. He tried to ignore the voice, which repeated over and over like a mantra. "They're going to kill you." "They're not going to kill me!" Clyn grabbed at his knees. "They're jealous, Master. They can't stand how skilled you are already. They can't stand that you were chosen while they were not. They are trying to think of a way to kill you that appears to be an accident, that will not bring about the Queen's wrath. If you starve, that is less noticeable than an attack." "It's not true." Clyn grabbed at his hair. "Shut up!" "I will not let you die, Master. I love you." Clyn raised his head to look at the sword, glowing softly in time with his own heartbeat. What was it, really? Where had it come from? Why was it connected to him? His family wasn't important. There couldn't really be a bloodline connection. Whatever it was, he was absolutely sure that it was incapable of feeling love, and he would not be manipulated. "I'm not gonna die today," Clyn promised. "You're hungry, Master. I'm hungry. These people are abusing their power. They starve children. This must not be allowed to continue." They sat in silence for a few minutes, as Clyn neither agreed nor disagreed with the sword on that particular topic. There were certainly worse punishments than being left alone. "Eyes took your freedom." "Don't fucking start," Clyn warned. "Mortals will never understand you, Master." Clyn sighed and looked at the door. He wished he could go back to sleep to pass the time. "Do you want to play a word game?" he asked. "They will take him from you. You should have never allowed him into your heart. They will take him as they took your parents, your friends, your home. These mortals are your enemies. You must slay them before they defeat you. They are trying to keep you from reaching your full potential." Clyn huffed. He wished that he had been in solitude in solitary, as was intended. But he was never truly alone. There was supposed to be safety in numbers. It's an old adage, meaning that the world is a dangerous place, and it is nearly impossible to navigate alone. But Clem would have given anything for the chance. It may have been dangerous to go alone, but with the sword, he felt as if he were the danger. He was the thing that made the world frightening. "Starving him?" came the voice of an angel from outside the thin walls. "You must have lost your mind. Clint is a saint. He is the avatar of a god. This is blasphemy." Clint grabbed the sword and hastily strapped it on, lest the girl see that he had taken it off. He knew how badly that would anger her. The sword was a sacred artifact and must be treated with respect. "Your Majesty," came the voice of an adult, "this is standard procedure. Our orders were to treat him as if he were a student in training." "Common sense should tell you to respect the avatar of Theseus," the queen retorted, her voice never rising to a shout, her dignity perfectly preserved. "This is sacrilege. I will pray for your atonement." The door opened and the sunlight blinded Clyn after the darkness of the cabin. "Clyn?" Xandra smiled at him as the light flowed behind her, beautiful, too beautiful for such a rough place. "Collect your things. We're leaving." He nodded and put one arm up to shield his eyes until they adjusted. As they stepped outside, he opened his mouth to ask whether she meant just what he had in the shed, or if he was supposed to go back to his bunk, but she spoke first, and all thoughts fled his mind. "I will wait to receive you in my chambers." She smiled politely, and Clem became very aware of the fact that he wasn't dressed properly. He wanted to say something, anything to her to explain, but he felt his face heating up and his body began to move of its own accord, and he ran. He absolutely bolted in the direction of his sleeping quarters, leaping over anything in his way, while the intricate carvings of the sacred sheath left scratches on his bare back. He raced to his bed, so much like the others, and threw open the cabinet that he had decorated with trinkets, knocking many of them off in his haste. It didn't matter, it was already rather plain compared to everyone else's, and he found that he no longer cared. It didn't matter, none of it mattered, the only thing that mattered was finding something decent to wear in front of the queen. He had some dress clothes, a sort of knight's uniform that he was expected to wear to his lessons at the castle, but it was a bit difficult to get into. He pulled it out in pieces and sat on the bed to assemble them into something presentable. Eurylian fashion had so many belts. He snapped the ones together that kept his boots on, but his fingers fumbled as he tried to get his bag to slide onto the big one properly. He chided himself, overly aware of the fact that he should know how to work a belt, that he was being ridiculous, that he was clumsy, and it was a complete waste of time for him to try to learn how to work a sword if he couldn't get a goddamn bag to fit on a belt like it was designed to. It snapped in place, and he wrapped it around his waist. He held a brush in his teeth as he rushed to the mirror at the end of the room. His hair was matted with sweat. Xandra had said that many of the nobility kept their hair long, in braids or pulled back at the nape of their necks, so he had tried desperately to grow his hair out, but it was often knotted, stuck out at strange angles, or fell, as it did now, drenched and lifeless. He wound a ribbon around his fingers and yanked the brush through the tangles, ignoring the pain as it tore free huge chunks that he was unwilling to waste the time working through. He tried to remember how the men in the castle wore their bangs. There was some particular way you were supposed to keep them, but his mind wasn't working nearly as well as he would have wished, so he parted them to the side and tucked the long strands behind his ear. With his hair smoothed down, he was able to pull it into a somewhat presentable ponytail at the base of his neck. He rubbed a damp cloth across his face until it turned red, and he had satisfied himself that he had most of the filth off, and stared at the man in the mirror. He looked stupid. He looked like a farm boy playing dress-up in fancy clothes. His tan skin didn't look the same as the nobles who taught him, or as the princess herself, as he was out in the sun too much. His muscles were too well defined, even under layers of fabric, and made him look bulky, instead of the ethereal aura the nobles seemed to exude so effortlessly. Despite his best efforts, his hair was still thick, and the blonde was all wrong, not the wispy gold of someone from the palace. It looked more like straw. There was nothing he could do about his eyes. He ran back to the bed and grabbed the sword, then back to the mirror to make sure that he clipped it on properly. He was racing a clock, keeping her waiting, and he was all too aware that he would never look into the mirror and see what he wanted. What he saw now was probably as good as it was going to get. He threw the brush back into the cabinet and closed it, then took off at a jog toward the castle. He stopped at the sound of the screams. A's. They're killing him. He turned on his heel and headed at a sprint in the other direction, towards the sheds. His footsteps slowed of their own accord as he took in the sight before him. The only person who had ever fought past the fear and dared to talk to him was kneeling in the open space, the square all the students feared. He, like Clint, had been stripped, but unlike Clint, he hadn't been given any fancy clothes to change into. Instead, his bare back sparkled in the morning sun, as if it were covered in dewdrops. Or blood. Clint moved his hand away from the hilt and held the wrist with his free hand to his chest. He took a step forward as the crack of a whip filled the air. There was no second scream. It was admirable, the way he bore it in silence. Clint found himself drawn to the spectacle, and the other students who had crowded around moved to give him a wide berth. It was obvious that no one else would be touching him. He had never seen it before. He shied away from the bloodshed because it made the sword more active. He held his hand in a death grip as the thing tickled the edges of his mind. It was beyond words now, beyond talking to him. It spoke in primal feelings, in urges. They were hurting A's because of him, exactly as the sword had said. It was right, and they deserved to be punished. He twitched and grabbed at the fancy golden embroidery around the neck of the dress tunic with his left hand, the hand that burned, the hand that tried to wrestle itself away from his brain and find the hilt of the sword. Crack. Twitch. Blood. The flesh fell away with each contact, and Clint could only barely make out the sound of Aza's voice past the gnawing hunger that ate at his mind. He was counting. After each strike, he would say, in a calm voice through gritted teeth, a number, a symbol that Clint knew but had difficulty dredging up, meant something. He was saying these numbers for a reason that Clint, like all the others, had been taught. It would end. That's right. This, like all things, like life itself, was finite. When he reached a certain number, it would end. The punishment would be over. They weren't going to kill him. He took a deep breath, and the grip on his clothing loosened just a little. He pried his fingers away and listened to the numbers. He slipped the hand lower, pulling it by the wrist until it settled over his heart. 10, 11, 12. It had to be 20. He was counting to 20 and it would be over. It would be over and he would know better than to try to interact with something he had no business interacting with, and the pain would stop, but the scars would remain. And every time he thought about stepping out of line again, he would remember this pain and he would know not to do it. 20. Get up and go wash yourself off. The instructor's voice cut through the silence of the crowd. Get dressed and get ready for class. They weren't kicking him out. Clint hadn't cost him his career. He could stay, he could work, he could learn, and he hadn't taken any of those things from him. He was smiling with the realization that the one mistake wasn't going to cost him everything when Aziz caught his eye. He stood, wincing, and glared at the stupid smile on Clint's face. Clint opened his mouth to say something, but Ace was already beside him, watching him with anger in his eyes, and he found himself rooted to the spot. Move, Ace demanded of the students to Clint's side. I don't want to get my blood on the chosen one's fancy clothes. The crowd parted even farther, seeing the logic in that command, and Clint pulled his hand away from where he found it, on the hilt of his sword. He turned and ran toward the castle.